Okay, so last week we touched off with some issues at the end, dealing with some things coming out of Daniel. So I'm going to go back to Daniel to try to cover two particular related topics coming out of the same text, starting with a question. Again, both of these texts are going to be dealing with Daniel 9:27, these components of the study. But the first question that we want to deal with, I guess this is week 9 of our two witnesses study, is a little bit off center in terms of the two witnesses. It's about the question of, we talked a lot about what the two witnesses are doing at different points in time, particularly the end. We've talked about their involvement in plagues and the final 1260 days and such. And I've indicated some reasons that I think Scripture indicates for us that the two witnesses are involved in the temple building or the activity at the temple in the first half of the week, which I think that if we see these discussions in Daniel and from Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, and the time frames that Revelation gives us for different things, it seems pretty clear. I think to most people it's not really controversial that there's an event 3.5 years before Jesus comes back to the earth and the Battle of Armageddon and that, where the temple activities are ceased or stopped as a result of the Antichrist, as Paul indicates, coming into the temple. Paul gives us some pretty clear language about that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And so that, coupled with the first part of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, indicates that there is a temple built, right? There's something that the Antichrist goes into. He's stopping some kind of ritual temple activities at the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which is a astonishing thing. I mean, to think about it in our world and in our terms, because we don't have one. We haven't had one for a long time. We haven't lived in a world where that sort of thing exists. Only in Scripture do we read about it. And for that to be a reality is interesting. And it invites some interesting questions for Christians who believe in a future coming of Christ, no matter what particular persuasion they have about when the rapture will occur. There's some interesting questions that come up here regarding this temple. In particular, questions like, who's going to be attending to this temple and performing the ministries that are going on there? What kind of ministries are going to be going on in terms of activity? For many of us as Christians, because, and certainly for many Jewish people today, because we haven't had a temple and we haven't had priestly service at a temple for almost 2,000 years, the events of the temple ritual on a regular basis, annual, weekly, monthly, seasonally, whatever, are a little bit unfamiliar to us to a certain extent. We may have the broad outlines of what it was, what was going on, and some of the things we might be a little bit more studied in some of our cases, but it's a little bit distant. And so, the coming of a rebuilt temple and the things happening there are of extreme interest. They may not be readily apparent to us what that may be, and it certainly invites questions. Can anybody think of some questions that Christians or that you might have that we might want to study regarding the existence of this temple? Like some things that pop up for us, especially in a New Testament era, in a post Jesus Christ first advent setting.
I think in the past we've talked about its location, like where would it be? Right?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. We're not going to get into that particular issue in this study, the particularities of the location, but that's certainly a question that's going to have to be resolved.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know you got what types of sacrifices or priestly practices are taking place there.
Yeah, that's going to be an important question, and tied into that would also be who's doing this, right? I mean, if this were a question about let's say Jesus had not yet come for the first time and there was no new covenant and we were just living in an extended period under the law of Moses, things unchanged since Moses and David and Solomon, etc., and Ezra and those guys, then this question of what a new temple would look like coming out of a period where there isn't one wouldn't necessarily be so interesting or invite questions, right? God just says there's going to be a new temple. It would be like, right, so we'll go back to what we were doing before. Like when they came back from Babylon, they didn't have to wonder what temple service was going to look like and who was going to perform the duties and how. They just had to find a way to get back to what had been instituted. But things have changed, and it's been, like I said, 2,000 years almost since the last time this was going on. And we've had the first advent of the Messiah and this new covenant that the New Testament talks about. And so there's some questions that pop up here. And then there's questions related to your answer to these questions in part relates to your perspective on the timing of Christ returning for his saints, whether that is before the 7 years, or I could say at the beginning of the 7 years, or in the middle or at the end. How you answer this, right? Because if Jesus comes back to get all the people who all the Christians who believe in him now at the beginning of that 7 years, that has implications for who's going to be left to attend to any temple that exists in that 7 year period after that point, right? If he doesn't, then there's some other options potentially. And in either case, the options may still be the same, right? Like you could say, let's suppose Jesus comes back at the beginning and all of the Christians who are living go up to heaven with him at that time. But then afterwards, you may have a world full of people, including Jews and Gentiles, who some of them may have had family who were raptured early or something. And they're like, wow, that's real. And then they convert, they repent, right? They suddenly get on board with Jesus because of the rapture being a real event at that point. And so you might have this, certainly it seems like there's going to be a collection of Jewish people in the area of Jerusalem and Judea who have some interest. And then you could have this other group of people who's from around the world who knew about this rapture, and then it happens and they're like, oh man, now I got to get serious about this is real. Those people were right. They're gone. They're okay. So you're going to have that possibility of Gentile and Jewish people. And you say, well, okay, of all those people who then believe in Jesus, who are turning to faith in Jesus, which ones of them are involved in the temple service and building it and all that in Christ, right? And on the other side of the spectrum, if we say there won't be an early return of Christ at the beginning of the 7 years for the believers, for the church, for Christians, whatever you want to say, then all of those people will still be here during the 7 years. And so then you have to think, well, who's involved in the temple activities then if the church and Christians are all still here? Are we excluded from that? Are we part of it? How is this going to work, right? Because in a traditional sense, based on the modern scenario, Jewish people who want to see the return of a temple service, rabbinic Jews who do not believe in Jesus, they're not inclined to permit Christians to come participate in that. And for the most part, most Christians are not really inclined to want to participate with non-believing Jews in a temple ritual that doesn't honor Christ. They see that as sort of having some problems for us because of the sort of denial of Christ's atoning sacrifice and his work, right? Like we wouldn't want to be a part of an animal sacrifice that denies what Jesus has done or doesn't take that into account. And so there's some conflicting issues here for both sides, depending on which way you go with this. And so there's a number of important questions I think we can ask about this first 3.5 years where there apparently is a temple and there apparently are temple sacrifices. And so I'm going to start with the question of what kinds of activities are happening at the temple, because there is some decent information on this that we can draw on and kind of come to some reasonable options and potential conclusions. And that will help sort of frame up some of the other possible questions along the way. So I'm going to start with the question of what kind of activities will be going on at this newly rebuilt end times temple. Particularly, we want to know, I think many people want to know, is are there going to be animal sacrifices, right? When most Christians think of the temple service, that's one of the hallmark things that we've seen, paintings or pictures of or scenes from movies where there's priests in a larger courtyard, there's a large constructed house behind them, and they're slaughtering an animal. There's smoke and fire going up, as part of the animal offering, and then somebody's going into the house of the temple or whatever it would be, right? So that's a part of our sort of our iconography, our concept of temple service is animal sacrifice. I mean, that's a pretty big part of what comes out of the law of Moses. And so for us to contemplate that, at the same time thinking as Christians, knowing that Christ has provided the atonement sacrifice for us, that the animal sacrifices, many of the animal sacrifices were meant to prefigure and to show the need for and to explain to us how this was going to work. It seems like there's a little bit of a conflict. Like, why would God start this up, especially if you're a post-tribber? If you believe that Jesus isn't coming back for anyone until at the very end, and then you've got this kind of apparent conflict. Potentially, if you believe in a pre-trib rapture, there's some sense of alleviation of that apparent dilemma, because the church is gone, so the Jews can get back to just doing this the Mosaic way, in that sort of way to honor the law of Moses in their interest in God and their devotion to God at that time, and so there's this potential opening there to resolve it in that way. So
that's a pretty long question, Scott.
Oh yeah, yes it is.
I mean, just from I think in order to get some kind of a picture as to what kind of activities that would surround the temple, the temple that's built during the tribulation period. Again, looking at it from the standpoint of pre-tribulation rapture, Paul says that you can't understand this. Spiritual truth is got to be spiritually discerned. There may be there will be quite a vacuum left. Actually, should the church be evacuated off the face of the earth, and the remnant that's left upon the face of the earth will only be those who have heard certain things about temple sacrifices. They may not understand them in a spiritual sense, but they'll have what I would consider a head knowledge. They've heard it spoken of a lot of times. They may be able to draw some conclusions. However, I believe they will have that opportunity to be saved and repent and ask the Lord to forgive them for their sin. But the temple itself, I mean, when you take a look at what Revelation chapter 11 describes, it says that there's no brazen altar. So to me, that would eliminate the fact that there's not going to be animal sacrifices per se. But however, there is an altar, which I believe is an altar of incense, which would be representative of the prayers of the saints and so on and so forth. In Leviticus chapter 23, the Lord gave Israel 7 holidays for them to observe. Some were agricultural in nature, some were memorial in nature. And just to give you a few offhand, there was the Feast of Pentecost, there was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, there was the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, only to name a few. I'm thinking that where there's no brazen altar, that the activity that surrounds the temple may largely involve the fellowship of these feasts, not so much coming together to render sacrifices per se for the remission of sins, because I think, again, going back to what people may already know, Christ has died on the cross. They've heard it time and time again, but in a spiritual sense, they haven't fully comprehended that. But they've heard it. So the Jewish nation, I mean, God is going to be dealing directly with the Jewish nation, Israel, and it would be very appealing in the mind of the Jew to get back to a temple worship scenario. Now, when the man of perdition is revealed, once the church has been taken out of the way, this man, the Antichrist, will be revealed. What's to say that he doesn't all of a sudden come on the scenes? He's got, we can read out of Daniel that he has, through what's it say there? And you got your thing right there, John?
Yeah, I can put up. You want Daniel 9 or 11 or what?
Bring up Daniel chapter 8, verse 25.
Okay.
And it says that through his policies he shall cause craft to prosper, and he shall, I can't see it because the pictures are in the way.
He'll magnify himself in his heart, and by peace he will destroy many, and he will stand against the prince of princes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to get to. By peace he shall destroy many. So what's to say? And I'm just gonna spitball here for a second, trying to think about, okay, well, how is he going to explain the disappearance of all of these people? He's going to come on the scene, and he's going to appear as a man that has all the answers. What's to say that he doesn't come on the scene and he doesn't say, and he says, hey, God is coming again, which he is. So we need to come back to a place of worship and worship the true and living God, Jehovah God, and reinstitute temple worship. And all of these Jews, it would certainly be very appealing for many, not only in locally centered in Israel, but those who are dispersed in different parts of the world, to come back to Jerusalem to partake of this building of the temple, this reinstitution of temple worship. Because remember now, anti means two things. It means in place of, and it means against. And the Antichrist will be both. He'll be against God, but he'll be here in place of God. So what's to say that he doesn't somehow cunningly, through his craft, through his peace, deceive many into thinking that they need to come back, build this temple, worship Jehovah God by the offering of incense, enjoying the feasts, if you will, from the Old Testament times, starting to bring all of that back into picture, only to find that because God is bringing judgment upon the earth, at the same time he's trying to proclaim peace, the Jews will be greatly blamed for the fact that nothing seems to be going right. I mean, it says there many times, I think in Matthew chapter 24, for one, that many shall turn against each other. They'll turn each other in. They will rat their fellow brothers out, and they'll blame the Jews or the believing remnant at that point for all the things that are going wrong, attributing the wrath of God upon that nation Israel, as it's their fault that that's happening. And I think the Antichrist, to some degree, will probably say, yeah, these guys here are the ones that's causing. Well, I'm trying to get you guys to come back to worship, and all this stuff is going wrong. It's their fault because they're not coming back with us. They're not siding with us. They're not being drawn into the temple worship. And so, at the time of the Great Tribulation period, it says there that they are to flee Jerusalem. When you see these things happen, when you see the abomination that maketh desolate, flee. Don't go into the house to get your clothes. Don't come down off the roof. Get out, because there's some things that are going to happen. And that, I think, at that halfway period, that's when he's going to break his covenant with Israel, and things are going to take a real dramatic turn. In that it'll be the time of Jacob's trouble, such as never been upon the face of the earth. Now that's just I'm just ranting and raving here, and just what I think that might be an option to consider.
I think it's good because you're providing for us a perspective of someone who remains in the camp of belief in a pre-trib rapture. So I take your point of view to be sort of an informed expression of what is part of the point of view that is circled out there in pre-trib camps about what this may look like. So now I have a couple follow-up questions for you, if you don't mind. One would be, in that view, is it typically seen then that the temple service is something that is done by Jewish people who don't believe in Jesus, Jewish people who do believe in Jesus, Gentiles who believe in Jesus, or the Antichrist is the one really in charge of this in the first 3.5 years, and he's trying to get Jewish people to involve it, and they're not? Or what do you think?
Sure. Well, I would think, again, Scott, I can't take you to a specific verse, but if I'm just guessing here. I'm thinking that perhaps maybe they will have some process whereby they actually have a high priest, like Caiaphas. Caiaphas in Jesus' day was the high priest, but we know that on a spiritual plane, He was not ready to accept the teachings of Christ. He was not ready to accept him as the Messiah. In fact, at the day of his crucifixion, they said, "We will not have this man rule over us." So they would, in my opinion, I think what they'll have is they'll have a priestly ministry, but it'll be similar to that in the day of the Lord, when they wanted to crucify him, they wanted to kill him. They would not have this man rule over them. So I think there'll probably be a pseudo kind of priesthood where I don't think they'll have animal sacrifices, because Revelation 11 doesn't speak of a brazen altar, taking the blood into the Holy of Holies and sprinkling it before the mercy seat or any of that business. It just basically says that there's an altar, there's a temple. It's going to be very downplayed, I guess, if you will.
Do you think they'll be frustrated that there's no animal sacrifice altar or any of the opportunities for that? Because I would assume that like a rabbinic, non-messianic Jewish mentality, especially a priesthood mentality, would be one that would intend. If you read what those groups today are seeking, it is a full functional animal sacrifice temple. So. Yeah, I'm wondering what the pre-trib point of view is on that. Are these guys just going to be frustrated that that's not being allowed to them, and so are they just participating then in like you said, the festival activities and such, but they're not doing anything else? Who's administrating?
That might be the catalyst. That's a good point, Scott. That might be the catalyst that causes the Antichrist to break his covenant, where they want to have a brazen altar, where they want to have animal sacrifices and resolve back to that kind of thing. And he doesn't want them to worship through the shedding of blood, but rather he wants them to worship him. He's standing in the temple, showing himself as though he were God. So why do we need to sacrifice? Here I am. I'm here. But that's a good point you bring up, and I think that might be, like you say, a very frustrating point, because they want to move beyond the feast days. They want to move beyond that and get back to a time where, in the Old Testament, to go back to a ritualistic sacrificial system.
Yeah. Well, so there was two things that I prepared to talk about tonight. I certainly don't think that we're going to get to both of them, which is fine. I'd rather have the conversation.
I'm sorry.
No. I'd rather have this. I'm glad that there's participation. I don't have to have an itinerary. We'll get to it at some other point. But since you're kind of introducing this stuff, which I think is important for us to explore, especially people who aren't necessarily settled into the point of view that you have, to challenge ourselves with it, to reassess, hey, is this something we've overlooked or whatever? Some of my notes, my direction tonight was to sort of explain how this would work in a post-tribulational dispensationalist position, because I think we do have the obligation to explain some things that emerge if there's a post-trib scenario instead. Like, okay, so you've got the church still here. That's going to be an awkward moment. Like with the temple, do we just stay at a distance and then non-believing, so there's questions that. But the other thing that you bring up, which I think is important, and was the other thing I wanted to address at some point, is the extent to which the pre-tribulational model, which we should be aware of, it has a very large, to a certain extent, a pretty big role for the Antichrist to play in the first 3.5 years, as someone who's helping to orchestrate and at least initiate and making possible, a critical figure in making possible temple activity in the first 3.5 years. And that has always been my experience within my knowledge, and certainly growing up in a pre-trib point of view, was that the Antichrist was instrumental in making the temple existence and reconstruction and activity possible. And what you're saying seems to fit with that very much, because you talk about this treaty that he makes. And that's come up before. So instead of going through what activities are present at the temple, I'll put that on hold for a second, if that's okay, and instead go to the other part, which is this question about scriptural indications about a treaty that the Antichrist initiates with Israel. And before I get into my explanation of why I'm not sure about that, I want to ask Kevin to give any additional information he has, so we're not leaving things out, of where this indication is coming from. I know of one particular passage which I had planned to discuss, but this indication that the Antichrist, the end times Antichrist figure, makes some sort of treaty or deal with Israel that allows them to set up a temple. And so I want to make sure we have everything on the table and I'm not leaving out before I jump into where I wanted to talk about it. So long question again, but I'm going to use Daniel 9:27. You've already mentioned some of the description of in Daniel 8 about the Antichrist as being someone who he lies and he deceives people and he speaks in peace. But is there other passages besides Daniel 9:27 that you know of that talk about the Antichrist or indicate the Antichrist, the end times Antichrist, making a deal with Israel?
Well, I think the strongest one that I can think of, and you're there too, is that which is described in Daniel, and the fact that, prior to 9:27, I mean, the angel speaks to Daniel and basically says, 70 years are determined upon thy people, and he's talking about the Babylonian captivity.
Mm-hmm.
But then he's also moved on to weeks. The commandment going forth to rebuild the city. When you take and break that all down as to the first 69 weeks until Messiah be cut off, where the agreement, I guess what I would say, and again, I'm just going to put something out there. I think we've touched upon this a little bit beforehand.
Sure.
But when the invading armies come from the north to try to take a spoil from the land, which is explained in Ezekiel 38, they're coming in a time of peace because they're dwelling in a city without walls. So they're coming into that land, they're trying to take a spoil, and I think that speaks differently than that of Armageddon, because in Armageddon, they're coming against the city of Jerusalem to destroy it. In Ezekiel 38, they're just coming in to take a spoil. After the church has raptured, I think you're going to see that invasion take place, and the Antichrist is going to be revealed, and I think through military force that invasion will be stopped, and out of the stopping of that, I mean, God's going to intervene and create some very miraculous things, hail from heaven. We've read it in Ezekiel 38, but then I think what's going to happen is that the Antichrist, that would be the catalyst for the Antichrist to come upon the scenes and say, look, God has voiced his displeasure about your sin, and we need to do something about that. Let's make a covenant. Let's make a pact. Let's go for a peaceful resolution here. We'll build the temple. We'll get back to that worship that we've been missing, because this is what I think God wants us to do, and all the time it's the Antichrist wanting to bring people unto himself. But as to another passage, Scott, that would say something about the covenant, I can't think of one offhand, to be honest with you.
And I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't blind, not coming from that perspective, having discarded it, that I wasn't going to end up leaving something out that you're like, oh, hey, wait, there's this and this that I hadn't taken into account. And certainly we can revisit that. It doesn't have to be that tonight's the end of the discussion on this, but yeah. So that brings up some questions that I have, that I'll just put out there, but we'll come back to them maybe. Is, who is the Antichrist? These are practical questions about the Antichrist being involved in some sort of peace agreement or arrangement or treaty or deal with Israel. Is what kind of person would he have to be in terms of his stature, his authority in the world to do that, right? So we know he has a 42-month reign of authority, according to the book of Revelations, indications in Daniel, from Jesus as well. So are we imagining that he has some kind of position where he can make a political arrangement with Israel at the very beginning? And how could that be? So these are questions I just rhetorically have had. Yeah.
For the class that the group that I'm that I have the privilege of leading through the book of Revelation, we were talking about, okay, well, who is the Antichrist? Is he going to be a Jew or is he going to be a Gentile? Because that's probably a question that's kind of weighing in the back of people's minds. And I thought I had one here that I handwrite all my notes for the thing, but there were some arguments for him being a Gentile. There were some arguments for him being a Jew. The overall consensus that we have discussed, I think he's going to be a Gentile. And I wish I had it. I don't have one printed out, but.
Well, I agree, and again, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, so I don't mean to be like, okay, Kevin, give us the full explanation, so we can move through that. I agree that my thought is that he's going to be a Gentile, but we'll get those questions that I asked sort of just out on the table for future. Maybe we can talk about that. And what I'll do now is I want to talk about this passage out of Daniel 9 about the most pre-trib positions that I've read, that I grew up with, books that I've have read, movies that I've seen on this in my earlier years, use Daniel 9:27 to say, here's the passage where we're told that the Antichrist makes a peace treaty with Israel that permits the rebuilding of the temple and temple service in the early part of the first half of the week. So if I read this, I'll just read it in Daniel 9:27. It says, and he will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Now, I'll just stipulate this, that I don't know anyone who doesn't take the word many to be a reference to Israel. Pre-trib, post-trib, I think everybody does, and there are textual reasons why I think that's the case in here. I mean, the result of this covenant is the establishment or the reestablishment of temple services, which is a very Jewish-centric idea, especially in the Old Testament period. So there's some sort of an arrangement between two parties, some sort of covenant that results in the reestablishment of temple service activities. And if you read in the context of Daniel, which we're going to do here in a second, when verses start talking about desolations, it's always talking about Jerusalem and the temple. So the effect here involves something that would seem very clearly to be Jewish-centric. So one of the parties here is the Jewish people, and I'll give you another reason why I think that's the case. The word covenant here is the standard word for covenant in the Old Testament for God's covenant with Israel. Doesn't mean that the word in Hebrew doesn't have other applications, but this is the word when we read about God's covenant with Israel. It's this one. In fact, Daniel uses this word in this passage to refer to God's covenant with Israel. So there's another clue that I think one of the parties is Israel. And again, I don't think that's particularly controversial. What we're discussing is who the he is, right? So if you come to verse 27 with the understanding that the Antichrist is in view, let's say that we thought that verse 26 said, and then the Antichrist will come, or then the son of perdition, or this unholy man will come in the end times, and he will confirm a covenant. Boy, that would really roll together, right? That would make a lot of sense. But we're starting with a pronoun in the Hebrew in verse 27 that we have to ask who that's referring to. And the answer that most of us have been accustomed to, even within, I think, pre-tribulational, post-tribulational circles as well, is that this is the Antichrist. Because who else would stop the temple services and desolate? And because I mean, that's if you read into verse 27, it says he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, which seems pretty apparent that the Antichrist is a critical figure in that cessation occurring, right? But I want to, at some point in my life, I wanted to investigate further to see if this was substantiated, and I came away with at least what I think is another strong option for who he is here. That and I may have mentioned this before, but I think, and this is what I said, I spent some time this week getting into this, that the he in verse 27 is God. That God will confirm in the Hebrew or Aramaic, as it may be, this is a word that means strengthen or make strong. He will prevail with the covenant of Israel, with Israel. and this will be for a period of a week, but in the middle of the week, he's going to cause the temple service to stop, right? And that's the part that makes most of us, just on face value, go, can't be God. God wouldn't stop the temple service. The Antichrist, we have indications from earlier in Daniel, from Jesus, from Paul, that the Antichrist goes into the temple. This is obviously going to be a disruptive event when it occurs. So we have that line of reasoning to think that he is the Antichrist. So these are the competing theories. And I think most people, at least this was true for myself, I had never thought there was any other possibility other than the Antichrist. So if you have this as the Antichrist, there's some kind of deal he makes with Israel early on at the beginning of the 7 years. There's just no other way around that. But I want to, and as I said, investigate that. And as a result, there's going to, if we keep both of these options in mind as we try to be watchful so that we're not blindsided by being wrong, we ought to think about the other one. And if God is the he here, which I have a lot to demonstrate that that's the case, then the question of a peace treaty with Israel, the Antichrist is instrumental in setting up temple service, becomes much more difficult in that scenario. Now, I'm not saying go with that and throw the other one out. I'm saying we're aware of one in which the Antichrist would be instrumental in starting a peace treaty and building the temple, and another where he may not be at all involved. Because if this verse is talking about God, not the Antichrist, then there's very little, at least in my experience, scriptural indication that the Antichrist is involved in much to start temple service, or very clearly early on. He certainly has some sort of political emergence in the world of politics, or an importance in the world in the early 3 years that sets him up for his rule in the 42 months that end the age. But whether he's involved in something specifically with working with Israel to set up the temple and such would be a much more difficult thing if this verse is not talking about the Antichrist. And so I'm going to lay out why I think that's the case. First of all, if we back up into verse 26, which precedes verse 27, we see that Daniel lays this out, as Kevin mentioned, that after a period of 62 weeks, which is to say 62 groups of 7 years, and before this, in verse 25, there's already been a 7 week period. So there's a total of 69 times 7 years. He said after that 62 groups of 7 years, the Messiah will be cut off, right? So there's this idea the Messiah is going to come and the Messiah is going to be cut off. Now, it's a standard language here for cut off, to be put to death from the Old Testament, from the Mosaic. And he's not going to be cut off because of something he's done or for his own issues, but for other people, it says here. And then it says the people of the prince that will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof will be as a flood, and unto the end war and desolations are determined. Now, if we ask ourselves to just interpret verse 26 in terms of what this prophecy is pointing to, the time frame here, I think pretty universally by futurists, is that this is a reference to first century events, right? That Jesus' death is coming and his death are mentioned in verse 25 and 26, and that after his death there was going to be a point where the city and the sanctuary were again destroyed, and there was going to be a war, and there was going to be desolations. Well, in 70 AD, starting earlier in the 60s AD, the Romans came, they besieged the city, they began exiling the Jews, they destroyed the city, they destroyed the sanctuary, and then they banished the Jews. All after the Messiah's coming and death. And so I think most people rightly take this verse to be a reference to the Romans, that the people who would come and destroy the city are the Romans. That's the city and the sanctuary that Jesus lived in, the Messiah lived in, and that they knew at the time. That was the one that was essentially built after Daniel's period of exile, was this temple initially constructed by Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, Joshua, and others. And then Herod renovated and reconstructed parts of it, and then Jesus went to that temple, and then the temple was destroyed by the Romans. So chapter 9, verse 26 is largely taken, I think correctly, as a reference to first century stuff, first century people, the Romans, Jesus, and some prince who is the identifier for this people. Now, if that's the case, we might ask, is this a Roman Caesar or a Roman prince? I've articulated that I think this is an angelic ruler. Daniel articulates this as he continues into chapter 10 and 11. You know, the entire book of Daniel, it contains these major prophetic visions, both by Daniel and also Nebuchadnezzar, of the transfer of dominion from one imperial power to the other, particularly imperial powers that had connections with Israel when it was a state with temple service and temple stuff going on. So you've got the Babylonians and the Persians, and then after them the Greeks, and then those three are all named by their ethnic name. Like Daniel is actually dealing with the terms Persian, Medes and Persians, I guess, Babylonian and Greek. But the Romans were way down the road from Daniel's time, 500 and something years down the road. And so the world renown for the people who would be the Romans, starting in the first or second century before Christ, were not really known in the Middle Eastern world with any great fame or importance at the time of Daniel. So Daniel, when he gets to this sequence of kingdoms, he doesn't name what would come after the Greeks, but he is told about a kingdom that comes after the Greeks in each of the visions, or at least in two of the visions, here in chapter 9, I suppose, and then also either in chapter 7 or chapter 8, it's talked about. And chapter 11 details this as it relays in more plain terminology. So if that's the case, and in chapter 10 and 11, when he's talking about the Greeks and the Persians, he's told by Gabriel at one point that there's an angel, he's called the prince of the Persians, that opposes Gabriel as God has sent Gabriel to speak with Daniel and to share future with Daniel. Gabriel, an angel sent from God, is opposed not by a human king, but by an angelic ruler associated with the Persian Empire. And then in that chapter, Gabriel explains after the Persian king, there would a Greek prince would come. So this language of a prince who will come is sort of attached in the book of Daniel to the idea of angelic rulers that preside over earthly empires. It's not a foreign topic to the Old Testament or to the New Testament that angels have some place of rule and authority over the nations of the earth, and that Israel is God's nation as opposed to these others who are under these other gods, or we know them to be created beings and angels. And so the long end of that is that verse 26 does not introduce any end times figures. At least it's not talking about end times figures. Sure, Jesus is an end times figure, and he's mentioned in verse 26, but verse 26 is talking about his first century developments and activities, not his return. It's talking about the destruction of the temple in the first century by the Romans. So if that's the case, and like I said, if we had the contrast, if verse 26 said, and then there will come a man of sin, a son of perdition, an antichrist who will oppose God and present himself as the Messiah, and he will confirm the covenant with the many, boy, that would easily mean the antichrist is the antecedent to the pronoun he, right? Like, what's the pronoun mean? Well, it's typically in many cases, you can find out what a pronoun is by the last named specified noun that was used before or after that, right? But here, if we ask, where's the he that's mentioned in verse 27, just kind of introduces it as if we should know who this is. It doesn't identify him, it just uses the pronoun. If we go back to verse 26, we might think, well, it can't be the people because the people can't be a he. So the other pronoun here would be Messiah. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily seem to work for us either. So we kind of hover on this idea of maybe the prince. But if that's the case, then we have to say verse 26 is referring to the angel or a Roman first century ruler. But in neither cases, it seemed that verse 26 is presenting a human end times figure known as the Antichrist. Now, there may be reasons why these things would somehow end up alluding to the human figure, but I think textually, one reasonable interpretation here is that verse 26 never mentions an end times human figure. And if that's the case, identifying the he of verse 27 as an end times human figure, particularly one that's in opposition to God, it is less available. It's not as easy. And again, a series of ifs here. So backing up we say, well, that's weird. God should really give us some more information about who this he is, right? He's going to throw something like this that's really important at us with a he. I don't know if you ever had people do that where they use pronouns too often and you're like, stop, who are you talking about? But in this case, I would think we might either, if someone is introduced in a text like this without particular specific information, it typically means if the author is competent, which I certainly think Daniel, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is competent, he thinks you already know who this is, that this character, this individual has already been sufficiently identified in this book, in this chapter, in this part of it. And so we need to ask, where is the he introduced? And I just showed that I don't think verse 26 presents a very clear case that a human end times figure is presented in this part of Daniel. So if we rewind and we go down to, let me skip down to where I'm at. If we go back to earlier in Daniel, and we were to read Daniel chapter 9 just as a chapter and get to 27 last instead of skipping to 27 or coming to 27 as we discussed the last week, the end times, but we discussed it as it's led up to by the author, then I think another option is presented here. So let me start with, again, the problematic issue for people who, like myself, who think that the Antichrist is not in view here is this thing that the Antichrist is, who else is going to desolate and stop the sacrifices, right? Who else? I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. But look at Daniel 9, verse 2. As Kevin referenced this a second ago earlier, it says, in the first year of his reign, one of the Persian kings, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of years whereof the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So if I ask this question, who's the he who brought the desolations to Jerusalem in verse 2?
That would be God.
God. Yeah, that's where I come away with. And also notice here that God causes the desolations and works in periods of 7-year groupings, right? 70 is 10 times 7. And so Daniel's like, all right, I know that God brought desolation to this temple and to this city for 70 years. And I want to know, 70 years are up. When are we going back? God promised he would return us, right? I'm going to pray to God about that. I'm going to petition God for that. And so throughout this chapter, Daniel fasts and he prays and he repents and he confesses his sins to God. And he's talking about this. And so he goes on in verse 4. He says, I prayed to God. I made my confession. O God, O Lord, keeping your covenant. There's the use of covenant in the text. It's the same word, right? God has a covenant with Israel. So linguistically, from reading comprehension, being fair with authors, if they introduce a term in the text, and it's the common meaning of this word is God's covenant with Israel, and then we see them use that in a specific way in this chapter to refer to God's covenant with Israel. We would want to operate with that at least as a reasonable premise going forward. And then it goes on to say that you, God, have driven them out. That's desolating because of their trespasses against you. They've transgressed your law, and you've poured out a curse upon us. Right? So who's the agent causing problems for Israel in these verses at the beginning of the chapter? It's God. God is disrupting the covenant situation because of Israel's unwillingness to accept him and to follow him.
I would take that one step further, Scott, in thinking it's not so much God is only reacting to what his people are doing. It's the people that have broken that they're the ones that have breached the covenant.
Right.
Otherwise, the Lord would continue on. I mean, I can't think of any scripture verse or any reading in the scriptures where God establishes a covenant and then breaks it.
Right. I agree.
Because I mean, and the reason why I say that is because it says in Hebrews chapter 6 verse 18, it says that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who had fled the refuge, laid hold upon the hope that is set before us. He confirmed, it says here that, wherein God, willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. Not only does he establish a covenant, but he also confirmed it with an oath.
Right.
So I think that's a little bit of a challenge for me to think in terms of God breaking his covenant. I think his covenant always stands. It's the people that break the covenant.
I think of it and God uses this analogy in some of the prophetic texts of the Old Testament, that it's like a marital covenant, in the sense that God's going to be faithful, but the spouse in this analogy has not been faithful, and in that case there was permission, and in some cases an incentive, that you would have to put them out of your house while they were being unfaithful. The New Testament even echoes that concept in Corinthians and such, that if an unfaithful spouse is remaining unfaithful, then the faithful spouse can't continue to cohabitate with them. And so there's this idea here, is Kevin's correct. God's not just deciding to break this. The people of these generations have turned away from the covenant. And so God is having to get them out of his house, get them out of the land that was his, because they've engaged in spiritual adultery and fornication by serving these other gods. So he's going to say, why don't you go live with those gods then in some foreign land, which he did with the Babylonians. And Daniel's living through that period into the end of that period. And he's asking God, okay, we went through that. We want to come back. When is this over? You said it would only be 70 years. And God is talking about that. And what he did in response to what the people did was to desolate the land and to move them out of that. Because they were in violation of the covenant. So that was a damaging set of events, right? That's not positive for the covenant. It was negative. But this is as Daniel says in verse 12, God has confirmed his words, right? So in this case, how is God confirming his words? Well, if you go back to Deuteronomy, God says to them, and I'm not going to read this whole section, but he says to them, look, if you obey the words of my covenant, blessings to you. You'll be the head of nations. Like nobody's going to come against you. All kinds of good stuff, plenty of crops. If you disobey, then I will, and he gives a list. There's contingencies, but one of those is, I will deliver you unto the hand of a foreign nation, and you will be taken captive far away, and they will desolate this land. And that's what the Babylonians did. Now, yes, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, existed. He was God's instrument in doing that. But if you look through Daniel's discussion here, it's God's decisions that are in judgment of his people that are bringing about these desolations. And so in verse 17, thy sanctuary is desolate, right? The Lord has done this. Now look at verse 18. This is the part that I think is interesting in relation to the two witnesses stuff that we looked at last week. In verse 18, Daniel says, O God, incline your ear and hear, and open thine eyes, and behold our desolations. Right? What desolations? The desolations of the sanctuary. Why does he pray to God that God's eyes would turn towards this? We remember Solomon's prayer when the temple was dedicated, that he said, Lord, let your eyes be upon this place. And he goes through his contingency. He says, if the people disobey and you punish them by taking them to a foreign land, and they pray to you in repentance in a foreign land, and I've got this pulled up in here, 1 Kings 8, he says, and they pray in their captivity, then let your eyes be open unto that servant in supplication and for the people of Israel. That's what Daniel's doing. He knows Solomon's prayer, and he's praying, God, bring us back like you promised. Answer the prayer that you said you would respond to when Solomon prayed. And then we see Zechariah, and we see other passages talking about these eyes, these 7 angels who are attentive to this. They're interested in it. And so I think that's what Daniel's praying for in concert with this. And I'll skip the part on Deuteronomy. And then Daniel's, he's praying, and it says in verse 20, while I was praying and confessing and speaking, while I was praying, Gabriel came. And Gabriel tells them, from the beginning of your prayers, I came forth to talk to you and to share and to explain this. And then verse 24, immediately after that, he says, here's what's going on. We had 70 years before. Now you get 70 weeks of years, 490 years that are upon the holy city to deal with transgressions. to make an end of sin, to make reconciliation, to bring in everlasting righteousness, et cetera, et cetera. So that's verse 24. Verse 25 talks about the initial 7-week period of the reconstruction of the temple and the city in troublous times. Verse 26 we read. And then verse 27 is he will confirm the covenant with the many, with Israel, for 1 week. It seems to me that a very reasonable takeaway from this chapter is it starts with God desolating because of the unfaithfulness of his people. He brings them out of land. He will eventually bring them back in, restore the temple for a period of 7 years. And in the middle of that, he will again cause desolations for his own purposes. And I think those purposes are to test his people, to try their faithfulness, and to purge from them those who are not really on board. There's a lot of discussion of that in different places in the New Testament, the Old Testament. God wants, in this case, to get only the people whose hearts are dedicated towards him, and to then bring judgment upon the instrument by which that desolation occurs, right? Like I said, Nebuchadnezzar existed. He did bring about desolation. He did have his people go into the temple. They defiled it. But God was the one who brought Nebuchadnezzar. And afterwards, God says in the book of Jeremiah, he says, after the Babylonians have done what they're going to do, I'm going to punish them because they went beyond, right? So God says in verse 29 that, verse 27 of Daniel, he says that let me read it so I'm not paraphrasing it wrong. The King James English is tough for me sometimes. He says, and he will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Now that all can be read with God as the he in this chapter with no problems. And for the overspreading of abominations, he will make it desolate until the end or the consummation, that which is determined will be poured out upon the desolate. And you could take this either as this is going to be the end of the desolations and the way God brings an end to transgressions and brings in righteousness. You could also read it as a punishment upon those who, like Babylon, were the instruments of this. Right? That just because God used Nebuchadnezzar doesn't mean Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians got a pass. God judged them. And so I think that is also something we should take into account as a possibility here. Now, if that is a reasonable position, then I think we are left with a difficulty in this idea that chiefly comes from Daniel 9:27, that the Antichrist is instrumental in some kind of arrangement that results in temple service. Again, I'm not saying let's just erase that from our minds because we want to be watchful of this stuff. But I'm saying let's also be watchful of what I think is another possibility. The Antichrist isn't really involved in this component of it whatsoever. And if that's the case, then that invites additional questions because it's not a circumstance where the Antichrist comes to some Jewish people after a rapture has occurred, or maybe even if a rapture has occurred, the Antichrist comes to a Jewish people and says, hey, I'm in some position here to negotiate with you to give you the rights to set up a temple. That event doesn't happen. So how does the temple get reconstructed if it's not initiated by some sort of arrangement made by the Antichrist? And those are good questions to explore as we remain watchful alongside with this more conventional position that's out there. So that really covers that component of this. Obviously, it opens more questions, and I certainly didn't get to talk about what we'll have to talk about next week now, which is some more information about, as Kevin said, I think the indications is there's no animal sacrifice altar, so that really kind of puts the end in that if you take Revelation 11 for what it says. But we do have to deal with Daniel 9:27 in that respect because it says the sacrifice and the oblation will cease. Well, when we read the word sacrifice, for most of us, I think for most people within a Jewish rabbinical point of view, go, animal sacrifice is going to stop at the midway point, which presumes that they're going on before the midway point. But Revelation says there's no court outside the house. There's no brazen altar. It's only the altar inside the house. So how do we reconcile that? And it's not, it's not like we can just go, well, Revelation ends this. Who knows what Daniel means? We got to adapt Daniel to Revelation. I think we have to pursue an idea where Daniel and Revelation are in harmony with one another without just having to overlook something in one of them. And there's a very reasonable way to do this, which I'll get into next week, but it has implications potentially for who is the main party in action at the temple, right? If this is unbelieving Jews, then we have to think about something like, or unbelieving Jews generally, the leadership of this movement is unbelieving Jews, then we would think that they're going to have certain expectations or certain things that they're doing or certain things they're not going to be doing. If this is a group of believing Jews, then they're who believe in Jesus, or Gentiles with believing Jews who believe in Jesus, then whether they're the church who never got raptured or the people who turn to God after the church gets raptured, then there may be certain types of things they might be inclined to do at a temple. And so to be watchful and to kind of explore these things, we have some questions to get into. I realize it's 8:02. This is a good stopping point for me in terms of the material. I do want to thank Kevin for taking the time and responding to questions and explaining so we can kind of get into some of this stuff a little bit more. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll do prayer requests as usual. And then again, hang out as long as people want to chat about this. I know we kind of run through a lot and there's a lot to think about. So we'll do more next week on this, but recording is going to get stopped. All right, 1 second.